Hello everyone, this is Sarah O'Keefe at Scriptorium Publishing. Welcome to our Content Strategy and Technical Communication webcast. Thank you for joining us today. We have a lot of people on the line, so we're excited about that. A couple of brief housekeeping notes. Everybody except for me is actually muted. You can ask your questions through the questions area or the questions tab that you'll see in the webcast interface. We are recording the presentation, but the attendees, and for that matter the questions themselves, will not appear in the recording. I may repeat and deal with some questions within the audio portion, but the information that you type in does not actually appear. So let's get started. What is content strategy? We have to start with Christina Halverson, who's sort of the acknowledged expert on where this term came from, and I have two quotes from her here. The creation, publication, and governance of content, or perhaps a plan to get from where you are now to where you want to be. And clearly we can apply both of those things to content strategy in technical communication. But one limitation that I'm seeing in the current definitions of content strategy that we deal with is that they tend to be really focused on websites and web content strategy. And in TechComm, we have a lot of other issues to deal with. First and foremost, the issue of print and PDF output, localization, embedded help, code comments, all sorts of other information products that we need to deliver that perhaps are not considered within the discipline of web content strategy. So what I want to do today is talk about the big picture of content strategy in technical communication. We tend to have some more complex requirements. So for example, we have to deal with issues of multiple outputs, of regulated content, of coordination with product development and product management, and also with complex conditionality, where you need to produce, for example, product-specific or customer-specific versions of stuff. So the way that we're going to deal with this in TechComm, I think, is to maybe start with a definition. So what is our definition of content strategy in technical communication? And I think this is actually quite simple. Content strategy is a plan for your information, and specifically a plan for developing it, for delivering it, which is to say to create the output that you need, such as a website or an HTML file or perhaps a print product, deploying that once you actually create it, so taking your HTML content and posting it to a website or maybe to multiple websites, and also destroying your information. This is one that I think we often leave out. We often leave out the issues of archiving, retention, and content destruction. When does the content expire? So at this point, what we'll do is we'll take a look at this, and I'm going to stop for just 1 second because I'm seeing a couple of audio notes. If you are having problems with the audio, do me a favor and type something into the questions tab. I see 1 or 2 comments, and I want to see if it's a worldwide kind of problem. Okay, so a couple of people are saying the audio is okay, so I will assume that this is a problem specific to 1 or 2 people, and we will move on. So you have a plan for the 4 Ds, developing, delivering, deploying, and perhaps destroying. And I think the first thing that happens here is that people say, well, I'm already doing this. It's not called content strategy, but I'm already doing this. And why are you telling me that I have to go become a content strategist? And I don't think I'm saying that. I'm agreeing that most people, and perhaps most people on this webcast, are doing the planning work. But there are also many, many people out there who have not thought carefully or maybe even at all about their overall content strategy. What they do is they open up their favorite tool and they start creating content. And at best, perhaps they've created an outline. Now, I don't think it's news to tell you that planning is good. And of course, planning is really, really hard to do when you have deadlines, not enough resources, not enough influence. It's easier to just put your head down and start writing. I think that content strategy as a buzzword perhaps can help us deal with this. So is it another buzzword? I don't think it's just a buzzword. I think that it gives us a label for something that is not well defined right now. And so planning a strategy for TechComm, planning a content strategy, is not just project manager, it's not just information architecture, it's not just what technical communicators do. I think it sits sort of above that. So if we think about it, from a visual point of view, then we have an overarching content strategy, and then within that we have components of your content strategy, so perhaps the tactics of content strategy. So first you need to think about the big picture. What content do I need? How am I going to deliver it? Where is it going to come from? And I put in 4 major pieces here, but there could certainly be others. So TechComm and then community strategy, localization, and training all need to be part of your overarching content strategy. You probably need localization in here. I think at a minimum you should probably account for future localization requirements even if you're not localizing or translating today. There might be some exceptions there within, let's say, government classified information, but even there you occasionally have information being shared across governmental boundaries and therefore a requirement to localize. Training and e-learning very often reuse information that comes from TechComm, or should, and that should be taken into account when you're planning your overall strategy. You may also have some additional requirements that I haven't addressed here. For example, traceability, where you have requirements and your requirements have numbers, and then the requirement has to be traced from the definition where it's originally created to the implementation in the product to the documentation. Similarly with bug numbers, sometimes you want to do traceability. Also controlled documentation issues, FDA validation issues. If you're in a regulated environment, you have some additional issues to deal with here. So the content strategy is perhaps the overarching principles that control where you put your content development efforts. With that, I want to take a look at a methodology for doing content strategy. This is not necessarily the one and only or the correct, but certainly this is one that you could implement, and this is how we do our work when we do content strategy work. So you analyze the existing workflow, you identify the problems, any new requirements, that's basically a gap analysis, and then you develop solutions to address those requirements. So for starters, you probably want to deal with the issue that it may not be broken, and if it ain't broke, you shouldn't fix it. If your current workflow meets your requirements, then you should keep it. From our point of view as consultants, we very rarely hear from people who have really, really nice workflows. What they do is they call us and they say, things are broken, please help us. So broken workflows that we see very, very commonly, we're delivering in PDF, but PDF is not what our users need. What can we do? What new things can we do? Our current workflow cannot scale. We have localization. We have more localization. We're adding languages. We can't scale up. The localization process can't keep up. We need a better process. Community participation is also important now, and people are contacting us and saying, we need a strategy for community participation. We don't know how to make this work. I have a few other examples, but I wanted to ask you for some contributions on this. If you would go into the questions tab and type in some other problems that you've seen and what is your biggest outstanding content problem that you're dealing with, and as those come in, I'll try and throw some additional ones out there. While you're doing that, we'll take a look at another slide because I do have some more examples of this. Developing in an agile environment, depending on what your current workflow looks like, it's quite common to look at an existing workflow and say, we cannot make this work. We're moving to Agile as a software development process, and we need a content development process that is compatible with Agile, and what we have right now is not that. Inefficient workflows, expensive workflows, low-quality deliverables, the need to align with product development, not necessarily in an Agile process, but that can certainly happen. And also complex conditions, and we see a lot of that, the requirement to deliver customer-specific documentation that goes beyond what the current tool set can do in terms of putting in conditions. So some others that are coming back here, and I'll try and send these out. So somebody said engineers and subject matter experts, no tech writer knowledge, bad translations. We're a community platform and deliver our best documents in PDF, which is sort of not so great. Oh, excellent, use of the word mashugana. No one golden source of content, 2 to 10 copies of the same document, so redundancy. Upper management doesn't want this input. Interesting. They want low-level stuff. I'm going to keep sending these back. There's some really, really great ones coming in, and you should be able to see them in the Answered Questions tab. Great content takes too long, not enough time. So that's an interesting one. Subject matter experts need to contribute content and are perhaps not able to do so now. Problems with cross-references and complicated mapping. That's maybe too specific, but interesting problem. Different information between tech, comm, and training. Need to move to single sourcing. Okay, so you get the idea. Every problem in the universe, perhaps. And thank you for sending those in. So what we actually need to do, once we have a list of problems, and I mean a list of specific problems within your organization, not a list of all the problems we've ever had in TechCom, because that would be really, really long. Once we have a list of problems, we need to look at the implications of those problems. And what I mean by this is, what is the business problem? Not the content problem, but the business problem. So how do you justify your content problem or fixing your content problem in business terms? What's in it? What's in it for your organization? So if we take a look at a couple of these examples that I gave you, and at least one of you mentioned PDF as an issue. PDF deliverables are not meeting the user needs. This is a quality issue because the users are unhappy. It is a money issue because the users are calling tech support, which is expensive. And formatting for print takes a lot of time, but users still hate it, which kind of goes along with bullet 1, and so there's a quality argument. That is the business argument that you have to construct if you want to move people away from PDF. You have to say, we have a quality problem, it's costing us money, it takes too much time, we can do this better. So again, I would ask you for your input on this. With the problem that you have, can you describe this in terms of time, money, and or quality? Preferably money. Time and quality are good too, but money is much, much better. If you can say, if we do X, we will save this much money. Oh, and by the way, we'll improve our quality too. And I will fling these back into the audience as they come in. While you're doing that, the comment back that your customers love the PDF, so maybe you don't have a problem. So what do you do with this? And let me give you an example of this. So the workflow cannot scale. You know, we're not able to scale localization. It's too expensive. It takes too long. What kind of a problem is that? Well, you have a quality problem in that customers interpret the English-only docs as a sign that you're not serious. You're not doing what you need to. So that is a problem. If you have a 6-month delay, and that sounds like a lot, 3 months is more common, but I have actually seen customers with 6 or more month delays between English and localization, or between original source language and localized products. Loss of revenue. We don't provide our documentation in, let's say, Japanese. Because of that, we're not doing as well in non-English markets. We're not doing as well in that market because people want Japanese. So something to consider there. And I see a couple of others coming through, so I'll fire these back so that you can see them. So delays. My customers don't love PDF. They want an easier method to get information. So those are the types of things that that you're dealing with here. So let me give you some other examples of this. Community participation strategies. We have this complex product. We cannot possibly document all of it. With our edge cases, we can't do it. So we need participation from community experts. This is a quality argument. If we can get the community experts to participate, then we will have better support, better information for our customers, and that's a quality argument. Now, related to that, if we can build a robust community and have the community experts participate, this is going to be less expensive than hiring additional people to create content internally, to create official content. So there's also a money argument. And of course, I'm sure you have seen the argument that building a community, let's just build a community and let the community document, and we don't have to do anything. We don't have to write any documentation, just let the community do that. It's been tried once or twice. It doesn't generally work very well, so I would probably not go there. As you build these things, you then have the ability to go in and work through that and build a business case off of these quality, time, and money descriptions. All right, so let's see what else we have here. Lovingly handcrafted, my favorite expression, costs time and money. Customization is an issue in here. And a community platform, and that's kind of a special issue of we have to, I don't particularly like the expression eat our own dog food, but that's really what you're dealing with there, that it looks really bad when you're a community platform and then you're not actually using the community platform to provide documentation in the way that you're recommending as a best practice for your customers. So there's kind of an issue there. All right, so yes. Once you do this, you can then identify new requirements. You know, what will the requirements be? You have a gap because with what you're doing and what you need, and you're showing the business drivers. Now you can take a look at additional requirements, new things that you want to be able to do. Some things that you might see here are community participation. Perhaps you're not doing this yet, but you want to. Accelerated deployment, it takes too long to produce that type of thing. Simultaneous shipment in multiple languages, the infamous sim ship, where on the day that your product ships, you're shipping to in all sorts of languages in all markets. Or perhaps new output formats. We want the ability to produce new stuff. So those are all things that you might want to do here. And let me take a quick look here at my comments. So yes, I know I have an issue with the slides. So a comment here that localization and content reuse is an afterthought, just in general. So I had a comment that said ARF, which I think was in relationship to the eat your own dog food comment. So requirement examples we have here. Once you have this, so now you have the things that are not working in my current workflow, the things I would like to create in my new workflow. From there, you can start thinking about solutions. You know, what are those solutions? How am I going to build the new solution? How am I going to make this all work? And at this point, you hope that you are going to have a very, very beautiful strategy like this. You take all your different factors, the skill sets of within your organization, your time and budget, regulatory and legal issues, user culture, privacy expectations, corporate culture, and you put them all together and you intersect them and you get this beautiful rounded pentagon in the middle, and there is your strategy. And of course, this would not be so difficult if you just had to go through these 5 things or a few other requirements, and you get this beautiful strategy nicely in the middle. Unfortunately, of course, what usually happens is you get something that looks more like this. So you don't have a match. Things don't go where they need to go. There's no perfect overlap. There's no perfect strategy. You have a couple of options here. You can either compromise and pick sort of the best possible fit, the place where the most of these circles overlap, or you could try and build your business case to move some of these circles back in. So you can move the available skills in with training or consultants. You can get additional time or additional budget if you can make the case for it, in which case that circle might move closer back to the middle so that you get better overlap. But of course, in reality, and we were looking at this slide, and the thought was that actually these should be 5 circles with 0 overlap, and that's reality for many of us. So if that's the case, then you really need to look at the question of how can you justify this? Can you build a really strong business case? Because if you can, then maybe you can get some money. Or if it's a culture and privacy issue, then can you change that? Can you move that along? And of course, it's much, much more difficult to change your user's culture than it is, for example, to improve your internal skill set. So depending on which of these circles is not overlapping properly, you may have some real problems on your hands. It's probably worth noting that regulatory is probably immutable. If you have regulatory requirements, you have to stay within those. You can't go outside them because there's a fun thing you want to do somewhere slightly different. So once you've sort of developed this and you have an idea of what your strategy, your plan is overall, then let's think about these 4 Ds: developing, delivering, deploying, and destroying. So developing, you need that basic axiom of technical writing: know your audience. Who is your audience? What are their common characteristics? Do they have demographics that you know about? Do you sell to a particular type of person in a particular market, particular education levels or ages or anything, any characteristics that your audience has in common? Is it Unix system administrators? They may not have anything in common in terms of age, but they might have some things in common in terms of how they like to work. And how does that audience, once you know about your audience, how does that audience like to get information? What is their preferred method for consuming information? This will definitely vary depending on what kind of content you're dealing with. A social worker within state government has different requirements than a Unix system administrator for documentation and for content. And part 2 of this is, what information do they need? What information do you need to deliver to them? And I think at this point, you don't say they need online help. That's already getting too specific. I think what we're looking for here is they need to know how to operate the product. They need to know how to open a case file. They need information about local laws that apply to using the product. So if you're documenting a cell phone and there are rules about driving with hands-free earpieces, that type of thing. They may need reference information, such as settings on a medical device. So I would, at this point, sort of classify the information that they need and perhaps even use information types. But what do they need at this point? Your use cases and your personas can help you with this. If you have personas for your product users and you have use cases for testing, those can probably help you then develop the, not outline, but the sort of list of content that needs to be provided. The other thing I would do at this point is take a really hard look at how to develop each type of information and who will develop that information. Your users, for example, might be the best source of troubleshooting information because they have in-depth experience. So perhaps you want to launch and promote a forum for troubleshooting information. The infamous World of Warcraft wiki is a great example of user-generated content that goes way beyond what any official documentation would ever provide. So deciding what information can and perhaps should be generated by the community is going to be part of this first phase that you work through. So, and I have a comment here that says project or product managers seem to regard this part of the process as overkill for help content. And I think that's probably true, but if you're discussing help content, then you've already sort of lost the battle, because you have to start with the question of, should it be help or not? That's a different question from what goes in the help. So something to consider there. And do I have any advice on getting buy-in for personas? You know, I don't. I'm a little bit skeptical about personas. I think if they're there, I'm happy to use them. But I don't consider them to be the be-all and end-all of the universe. So if you can get them up and running, great. And if not, I don't think I'd waste too much sleep over it. But that's just me. I know other people like them much more. So you develop. Now, the next thing that you do, and this is actually, this goes back to the question of, I'm not getting buy-in on this for help. What is the best way to deliver each type of information? So we haven't even decided yet whether or not it's going to be help content. We're still back on what do we need to deliver, and then what parts of that perhaps go in the help. So how are we going to do this? And I want to point out that the wrong approach is to take your or even your department's current knowledge of tools and technologies, software that happens to be lying around, and personal preference. That's not the best way to figure out how to deliver content. The question is, what is the best way, not the way that is most familiar to me and not my favorite way, but what is the best way to deliver information to customers? Now, I assume that some of you are actually already yelling at me and saying, but I can't get my company to give me new software. The software has already been determined, and that's a reasonable point. But that doesn't change the answer of what would be best for your users. And if you're not delivering what's best, that's something that you should be aware of. Now, if for whatever reason you can't deliver the best thing and you have a constraint of I can't change my current tools, that's reasonable, and that's something that you may have to do, but I would still do the work to figure out what would be best. I may not be able to do what's best. I may not be able to do what's best this week, but let's start with that question. So you have lots and lots and lots of delivery options, everything from paper, and let's not forget about paper. Paper is useful in environments where laptops, internet access, and electronic devices are not available or not allowed, and I've run across a lot of those in my career. But you also might have a web-based configuration tool. We're seeing a lot of customers that traditionally had data sheets, sort of a two-page description of a product, which have now evolved into a web-based configuration tool. So you never download a data sheet and look at the specs. What you do is you reverse that process. You, as the end user, say, these are the specs that I need, and then the system says, oh, this product meets your requirements, and then it shows you just that product instead of having you plow through data sheets. So a web-based configurator might be more sensible than data sheets. On the other hand, you might need data sheets if you're selling at a trade show, for example. Help and embedded help are delivery options. Web pages are delivery options. Forums, wikis, collaboratives, there are all sorts of different options here. And of course, video, screencasts, animation, podcasts. And I could add more here. There are lots and lots of different things that you can do. And I would not necessarily start with an assumption that there's a specific thing that you have to do. I like books. Books are my friends. I enjoy books. But let's not assume that books are the right answer, or for that matter, a PDF. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. And I think at this point it's probably worth noting that your content strategy should include looking at the question of how do you provide information in non-book ways, non-help ways, things that aren't really recognizable, information that's embedded, icons, labels on the product. There are a tremendous number of things that you can do that are not recognizably traditional help or traditional books, but that might be perfectly effective. So the question is, what is the most effective thing that you can do? As part of your overall content strategy, for the most part, I believe that you're going to also need a community strategy. Now, there are some exceptions to this. There are a few products that will not be able to do community, but they're actually quite limited, especially when you consider that you can do community strategy behind a firewall with registered users, not necessarily all the way out there in public. So when you start thinking about community strategy, first you need participation. You need people to participate, and it's actually much easier to create a community for large mass market organizations. If your audience is very small, or if you're introducing a very new product, which means you don't have a community yet, then building that first community is going to be very, very difficult. Getting people to sign up, getting people to read the forums, getting people to contribute on the forums, or whatever wikis, other kinds of things you might build. It's very, very difficult to get that up and running. Once you get it up and running and you have people participating, you then run into moderation. What are your rules? Will you allow people to curse in a post? Will you allow swear words? How impolite can people be? Can they attack other members, or will you shut that down and moderate it? What if somebody posts information that is technically incorrect? What do you do about that? What if the information they post is negative but not technically incorrect? I don't like the way this works, or this is a terrible feature, it's never worked for me, don't use it, try this other thing. How will you moderate? Will you use a light hand or a heavy hand? You also, at this point, probably start having to worry about Godwin's law, which is the law that says that as a discussion, particularly in a forum, gets more and more heated, the likelihood that somebody will invoke Hitler approaches certainty. And so, of course, once that happens, there's a huge mess, and you have to deal with that. So what do you deal with? How do you deal with flaming? How do you deal with people trolling? People posting things just to cause trouble? How do you deal with your competitors posting things just to cause trouble? These are typically called sock puppets. And then there's the feedback loop, and I think this is actually the most challenging problem that you're going to have. You post content. Your users have the ability, let's say, to leave comments on the page. So you post a topic of some sort that's how to configure thus and such. User leaves a comment on that that clarifies what you posted or what you wrote. You read the comment. The comment is useful. It's good information. It should have been in the topic. So you update your topic. You push the new version out to your website. Okay, now what do you do with the original comment? Do you delete it? Do you send the commenter a note thanking them for the comment? Do you archive it? Do you have to give credit to the person who commented in your topic update? Can you just plagiarize the comment and sort of inject it into your information? Those are all sort of interesting questions, and often people get very, very cranky if you do not give them credit. And I think that's fair. If I leave a comment and I contribute something, and then it gets incorporated into the next version, it would be nice to have a little note at the bottom that says, you know, includes comments from so-and-so, or thank you to so-and-so who provided some information, that type of thing. So there's some tricky issues to deal with there. So a couple of interesting questions and comments here. One, you give credit because that encourages a, I think, virtuous cycle of participation, and I would certainly agree with that. And another one, I think, from earlier, by the time I come along, the deliverables are established. If that's the case, then I would go ahead and do the deliverables as expected for the moment and then think about long-term strategy. But if you can show a business case, then you should be okay. And then another comment saying, how do you make a case for cost savings for content strategy when you work in a culture that values the ceiling tiles more than the manuals? That's a hard question. I can think of a couple of answers to it. Step one might be perhaps let's go somewhere else. But I think I would look at the question of, well, how much does it actually cost to produce the manuals, and how can you make that process more efficient, more effective, more improved, and that type of thing. So something to consider there. So, and somebody else, by the way, to the person that left the ceiling tile comment, you do have some agreement on that. So I don't know if that makes you feel any better as the original commenter, but there you are. So let's take a look at some other things that you're going to be dealing with here. And at this point, I think I'm going to run through the rest of the slides. I am going to take questions at the end. We're going to cut those off from the recording, just so you know. Regulated environment. So if you are in a regulated environment, then your rules are going to be a little bit different. You clearly have to do what the regulators want. That's not really terribly optional. Within that, you may have some options. You may not. It just really depends. And the example here, in case you're wondering about the slide, is that some marching bands are more creative than others. They all march around on the turf, but some of them do more within the constraints of what a marching band does than others, so something to think about. Also, even if you're not within a regulated environment, your legal department may push back on this. I've run into some issues where legal sets some rules and says you must do certain kinds of things within the documentation, within the content, and if that occurs, then you probably cannot get around that. So we've thought about developing. Now we have to think about delivery. So what is the best format for our audience? What is the best content format that we can deliver? How are we going to create this format? That's where the tools come in. So it's not until now that we actually think about tools. We thought before this about maybe deliverables and deliverable formats, and then we get to think about tools, not, oh, I have tool X and I like it, so we're going to do our content this way. That's backwards. You're also going to have content management issues, and I don't mean necessarily you must get content management software. Possibly you need content management software, but more importantly, no matter who you are, you have to address the question of how do I make updates, how do I version my content, how do I manage localization, how do I manage reuse, and how do I manage versioning if I do have conditionality variations within my document. Again, this doesn't mean necessarily please go buy a CMS. It just means you have these issues in all kinds of content, and you have to figure out how to address them. Once you deliver, so once you actually create the output format, maybe it's a PDF, maybe it's HTML, maybe it's a wiki with outlines in it, you have to deploy, you have to get that information to your audience. This may be a very straightforward process. It may not be. So let's say you've generated some HTML content. You now have to get the HTML content posted on your corporate web server. And that sounds easy, and it should be, but it turns out to sometimes be actually quite difficult because you have these turf battles between TechCom, IT, and perhaps web services. Other deployment issues you may have are things like embedded help or context-sensitive help, or help, which might be part of a software deliverable. So you have to not just deliver, but also integrate your format into the distribution process. If you're creating EPUB content, you can create an EPUB, but until you post it to the Apple Store, it hasn't really been distributed. A Kindle file, similarly, would need to go to Amazon. So that's the deployment process. How do you get it there? This should be a pretty straightforward technical problem, but sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. And then we have destruction. What do you do when information becomes obsolete? Do you get rid of it? Content retention and destruction are typically really, really challenging because these are not technical problems. These are policy problems. You have to get the rules all set up within your organization. Let's say you post version 2 of your software doc on your website. Well, what do you do with version 1? Do you delete it? Do people still need access to it? Do you demote its importance in keyword searches? What if I'm, as a user of version 2, I search on something and I find version 1 documentation? That's not good. You want to make sure that if I hit version 1, I know that I'm on version 1 and not on the most current version of the content. Of course, that argues for just destroy version 1, remove it from the website, but that may not be a legitimate way of doing it. You may still have users on version 1. Perhaps if I'm logged into your website, you know who I am, so you can feed me the correct version for who I am and what I have licensed. And that would be a possibility, but that's hard from a technical point of view. Again, in regulated environments, you will be told what you have to do in terms of archiving and retention, and you have to do it. In unregulated environments, again, your legal department may be involved. I've run into some organizations that insist on archiving content quite carefully for any possible future litigation. Or nobody's going to tell you what to do, and you just have to build an appropriate process to archive stuff. My advice would be, even if you're not in a regulated environment, even if you're somewhere pretty wild and woolly, you don't ever want to delete your source files or your deliverables. So when you finish a version of something, make an archive of the final files, the source files, the graphics, whatever, and of the deliverables, and put it somewhere safe, secret. You don't even have to tell anybody you did it. Just stash it somewhere. This is not so easy to do for something like a wiki, where you have the ability to continuously edit and there's not really a deliverable per se. In that case, I would look at the question of a monthly snapshot or a weekly snapshot so that you can at any point roll back and go back and look at the old information. But really think carefully about what that strategy needs to look like, because you really don't want to be in a position where you can't get back to it. I don't think I have the ability to go through a presentation without a slide on change management, so I will put this in here. You may not be able to implement your ideal content strategy right away. In that case, I would take a look at incremental improvements. What small things can you do? It's important to recognize that your requirements are going to change over time. So you may not want to be locked into a solution that looks good but that can't accommodate new requirements. One option here is to componentize, which is a horrible word, but to build with components. It's typically more work to set up components and put these pieces together, but generally when you do that, you're going to get a more flexible solution over time that you can add to or subtract from or modify, because if you have all these little modules, you can change just the authoring tool, or you can just add a new publishing workflow. So that's something to consider, but it's more money up front. And I think the other thing is that, especially if you're going through this process of, okay, we're going to make this huge change, that initial effort is clearly going to be a significant kind of effort. And you want to be sure that whatever you establish can, in fact, evolve over time to meet any new requirements that might come along. Look at your requirements today versus what they were 5 years ago. Look at the difference there. So you want to review your strategy every few years, see what changes you need to make, and see how well you're executing. Maybe you said, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this, but you've only been able to do 2 out of the 3 things. Is it time to add that 3rd thing? Can you pull that off? What do you think? So having said all of this, I wanted to do a quick poll. I'm very curious what you all think about this content strategy thing. So I'm going to launch a little poll here. I would like for you to throw in some responses here, and we'll take a look at what you think. Of course, I am dealing with a self-selected audience, but is it fabulous? Is it a fad that will go away? Is it just sort of, whatever, I'm not too excited about it? The other thing I would encourage you to do at this point is start asking questions and post those into the questions tab, because we are going to cut off the recording in just a few slides, and I will take your questions for the remainder of our time. So I'm going to give you a few more seconds to work on that, and while you do that, I will drill back through my questions and see what we've got. Okay, so let's take a look here at and I see I have lots of questions, so we'll see where this goes. I'm going to close the poll. I've got voting from about 80% of you. So let's take a look here and see what we come up with. So I'll close that, and we will share the results. And there you go. Now, given that this is a self-selected group of people that chose to attend a presentation on content strategy, I think we have to take this with a grain of salt, but it is at least interesting. So 79% of you think it's fabulous, and 20%, give or take, are not so sure. All right, a couple of last things, and then we'll cut the recording and take some questions. I wanted to give you some resources. These will be in the slides. The slides will be available to download. The first two, again, the generic content strategy is basically really web content or MarCom content strategy, and I've seen very, very little on TechCom, so there's kind of an issue there. Couple of notes, I will post the recording in, give us 3 days. We usually do it faster, but you never quite know. And we also have some upcoming events, so you might want to take a look at those. And with that, we will end this presentation.